Hello everyone, welcome once again to Geekfest Rants. Today we have a unusual little episode. We're going to be previewing The Rise of the Planet of the Apes, which is a film that's coming up pretty soon. And we're going to touch upon a little bit of the past. In other words, where all this came from. Because obviously the Planet of the Apes franchise has been around for a long time, and it's probably bigger than most of us realize it is. The film and the story went into many different directions and many different outlets, but most known are the films themselves. Joining me today is James. Say hi, James.
Hey, everybody. This is something that I kind of liked to do because I call this dim sum and a monkey. Last time we talked about Hong Kong movies. This time I figured we could talk about the monkey. That way we can still have dim sum.
All right, well, let's start with the actual original Charlton Heston film, which is the one that I imagine most people know, and it's the classic. It's the sci-fi classic.
Yeah, it's definitely the classic. This thing is about 42 years old, and
wow,
it still feels relatively fresh when you watch it because of just the way politics and things are.
The theme is something that you know, and the location is something you can't say, oh, that looks dated. No, it's sci-fi, so it's so out there that it's never dated.
And even though the makeup may seem a little old,
yeah,
it still holds up because it was done with all practical applications. The people who wore the makeup wore every bit of it. There's no CGI, everything was done by hand to the face.
Right. I think the danger now with the advancements in technology are even greater because we can recognize the development of CGI now, and you can say, oh, that looks so 80s and that looks so 90s. So it's a little more dangerous now. But back then, because they were still using prosthetics and, you know, latex and, you know, gluing stuff to people's faces, you kind of accept it and move on.
Yeah, it was revolutionary at the time. The people who worked on it really wanted this to be believable, that humans and apes would be interacting, and I love it. You know, it's not one of my all-time favorites, but every time I watch it, I feel like it's still exciting, the first movie.
Well, the theme of the first film is a pretty straightforward theme. The title suggests something that works itself into the twist of the film. Now, from what I understand, the film came from an idea from a book. And the book, it's pretty loyal to in terms of the story, except it has some twists that I never thought existed. In other words, in the film, the biggest twist is the ending. In the book, the twist is also the ending, but it is nowhere near what we saw in the film.
Yeah, the book came from the early 60s from Pierre Boulet, and his plan was to have a society of apes,
right,
that were actually conducting themselves like 20th century man. They had cars, they smoked cigars, they wore regular style clothes.
It was their planet.
It was their planet. So when the movie came about, they had hoped to go that way, and in fact, Rod Serling from The Twilight Zone,
yep,
was one of the people who worked on an early screenplay, and it turned out it was getting too ambitious. They were just trying too hard to keep to that, and budgets, you know, things like that. So they made a change, and, you know, allegedly Charlton Heston made this change, you know, who knows, but they said, let's do it like we're in a more primitive area, more primitive time. And it seems to work because you don't know, is this another planet? Throughout the whole movie, you don't know, is this another planet? What is this society?
Well, you're given that.
Where is this world?
That's the given.
And little hints pop up as the movie go on that some things that are familiar to regular modern audiences start popping up, and then it's like, wait a minute, there's more to this story.
Right, and like I said, that's the given of the movie. If, for example, the movie would have ended without that iconic ending, it's still a pretty good movie.
Or if they had planned to make sequels and let us know a couple movies down the line. But I'm glad they did it again.
However, because it was one of the creators of The Twilight Zone, that's a typical Twilight Zone-y kind of ending.
Exactly.
Which I'm glad they kept.
Yeah.
I'm glad they kept it because from what I understand, like you said, most of the stuff he wanted to do, they couldn't afford it, they couldn't do it, but they did keep that twist at the end that blew everybody away.
The entire movie for its time had a lot of tie-ins to modern society and how people were being medical science, how people were treating animals, how people were treating each other. So socially, audiences were starting to see movies differently, and futuristic movies were being used as analogies to present time. which made it a little more acceptable. Star Trek had been doing that. I mean, people
Right.
have been doing it historically for a while, but now science fiction was the place that... This was early 1968 that the movie came out, so it's a little bit before 2001: A Space Odyssey, which a lot of people say changed how people saw the space in movies and things like that, and how they presented it.
Once again, when we compare the book did not have that particular twist ending, but it did have another twist ending that only works in a book. And that is, from what I understand, the book is being told as somebody who finds a message in a bottle and is reading the story of what happened to this alleged astronaut. By the time you get to the end of the book, you realize that the people reading that particular story are apes themselves.
And I don't want to jump ahead too much, but the remake with Mark Wahlberg kind of uses the original ending from the book.
Correct.
In a way. Unfortunately, we never were able to exploit that.
Why?
Or they never were able to
Exactly.
exploit that because...
And that is kind of like the ending of the original book.
Yeah.
He escapes from the planet of the apes and goes back
to his own
to his own world, and he realizes that's been taken
It's
over.
the planet of the apes.
But it's not the same.
No.
It's a different planet.
Yeah, it's more modern.
Right. It's not as twisty, but it is ironic. It's an ironic ending, which is weird because, like you said, that is something that looked as if they wanted to get into with that 2001 remake.
Yeah, so Planet of the Apes was considered at the time very successful. It turns out it only made like $30 million, but in 1968 that was considered very successful story-wise because the fans liked it, and story-wise and monetarily. The big summer blockbusters hadn't really come yet. That was a few years away. So they continued to make more movies, and Charlton Heston really wasn't interested in it. He was a big star, and he really wasn't interested in continuing in this franchise, but he said he would come back. He wanted his character to die early, and then they can go on, and hopefully,
I'm sure they gave him a boatload of money.
Yeah, they said he would do his thing, his part, and then move on. And maybe even the whole series would end after that movie. So they hired James Franciscus to be another astronaut. And, you can watch the movies to get the whole gist of it. I don't want to ruin it for anybody who hasn't seen them, and for people who hasn't seen them in a while, you should go back and watch it. But the story utilized that world, that universe. Unfortunately, Roddy McDowall didn't come back.
Correct.
Because he was doing another movie. So, although he became a huge star as a result of that,
right.
Even though nobody saw him, they loved his performance, and he was well known, and then he was really well known. So it was disappointing.
The other thing is that for the sequel, they tried going backwards in terms of trying to get the original writer of the book to maybe come up with a script. And he did. He came up with something which bits and pieces of it made it to the final script, but not exactly the way he wanted it done.
And that's the trouble with Hollywood. Everybody has an input, so one guy can't usually do a whole franchise or do a whole story unless he's got some clout. And at that time, the way movies were made, first of all, science fiction wasn't that well respected. They just wanted to make money. They weren't looking for high art.
Now, unfortunately, the motivation behind the sequel, which is probably the motivation behind most sequels, was money. In terms of, it wasn't so much that they had a great idea and they wanted to expand it into a great story like the original. This was more like they had a couple of good sequences or settings that they kind of said, okay, can we develop these sequences or these action scenes or these settings into a story? Which is kind of backwards, if you tell me. It was done backwards, but it was franchised. They finally got their hands on a potential franchise.
20th Century
so they're
Fox
trying
needed
to
money. They were
expand.
going broke at that point, and this was something that they thought would save them.
The second film, which is Beneath the Planet of the Apes,
Which is my favorite, actually, because I love that it's in New York and in the church, and these are places I knew as a kid, so it was fun to see them in that post-apocalyptic look.
The movie basically wraps up. They attempt, I would say, to do another classic ending. That seemed to be one of the major goals of that film, was you gotta outdo, or you have to try to at least get to that kind of classic ending. And then the way that they wrap it up is by blowing everything up. Now, as of that ending, I don't know if there was any hint that they could possibly continue, not so much with prequels, which is what they did, but with sequels.
No, it really was a sequel. I don't know if people realize it. The next movie really was a sequel, and one of the people involved in the making of the movie said he kind of wanted a circle. So once again, even though there was a finale to this story, executives felt we can exploit this even further. It made some money. We can go one more. Maybe we can come up with something. And it turned out that Within the second story, allegedly, the two main chimpanzees were going to take the spaceship that Taylor had crashed in. There's a very small scene of it being pulled out of the water, and they were going to use it. Now, we're to assume by the time the new movie starts that they get in it, they figure out how to do it.
Or sometime during the movie.
And because of the explosion of the nuclear weapon, it caused a rift or something that causes a time warp,
It's basically,
and they go back to 1973.
It's basically the lightning on Back to the Future. You need the car and you need the lightning to hit at the precise speed. Well, they needed a nuclear explosion to boost the ship.
It's science fiction. That's fine. We're supposed to believe. There's a lot of things in movies that aren't quite believable, but we live with. And then they go back to 1973, which is contemporary time in our world.
Yeah.
And there's a whole movie now on how a social commentary on how animals are treated again and how by people, and it's in reverse.
Now, what's the name of the third movie?
Escape from the Planet of the Apes.
Okay, now, by this time, I imagine they're trying to do them similar to Star Trek. Faster, cheaper, smaller. And by bringing them to contemporary locations, you no longer have to create these elaborate sets.
And it saved a ton of money.
You don't have to create 800 masks. You got only 2-3 masks, and that's it.
In fact, the third character that went with the two main chimpanzees was famous actor Sal Mineo, who thought, like Roddy McDowell, he could get his career on track. He was a little older guy at the time, and he was trying to, have lightning strike again. I don't think it really happened, but it was still interesting to see him get involved. In fact, something I missed about famous people being involved in the makeup, Edward G. Robinson was expected to play an ape in the first movie because he had worked with Charlton Heston, and it was somebody that Charlton Heston liked. And it turned out he just couldn't handle the makeup, and it was not something that he wanted to go through every day for the length of the filming. So he didn't get involved.
Now, this film starts to, in a way, I would imagine, set up the new film we're about to watch now in a bizarre manner. But it also works either way, because in other words, even if you're dealing with the original story, there was a point in human history where this takes place. We don't see it in the first film, but this is a way of kind of rewriting it. This is where writers get into trouble with the time
continuity.
The continuity.
And the chicken and the egg. Well, which came first? How did it happen? This could have been how it happened if it's a big circle, and it just happens again and again. However, there's probably like a happy coincidence that it worked out this way, and they worked themselves out of a corner.
Right, but it's ironic and it's pretty, and it makes your brain hurt. It's a trick that you do with time travel films that you hint that the reason why A and B happens is because of something you did, not because of something that happened completely out of your control. And this movie is saying, okay, here you go. This is how it started.
In addition to this movie also having a bit of a shocking ending, it has a very depressing ending as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very sad, and it's one of the few movies that our main characters don't really make it.
And I also imagine this movie...
Our heroes kind of don't make it.
This movie, out of all the ones we've seen before, is the heaviest in terms of saying, wait, the story's not over. This definitely needs a sequel. It's like telling your audience, guys, I know this isn't as good as the other ones, but please don't run out on us. We have another one coming.
We got some more surprises.
And this movie and the next one are more together. They're more like a pair that you have to watch.
They start getting darker, and they start getting a little heavier socially. But the quality diminished a little bit, but you can still respect it because you're enjoying the story that they're telling and where they're taking you. And a little surprise in this one for people who happen to be soap opera fans, a young Eric Braeden, who has been on Young and the Restless forever, plays the main scientist that interrogates the main chimpanzees.
Okay.
And he's pretty well known. So when you see him now, everybody knows who he is, and they say, oh, he's on Young and the Restless. At the time, he was just another actor who was getting a movie part.
So this film ends basically with our main characters dying and their baby being hidden away.
With a very special actor, a very special surprise guest in the science fiction world.
Mr. Six-Pack himself.
Mr. Rourke and Khan from Star Trek.
He winds up playing the carnival owner.
And saves, and does a switch.
Saves their baby Caesar.
And exactly, which sets up completely both the sequel and the new movie that we're expecting.
And now we're back to, again, we mentioned before, now Roddy McDowell is back in these films. Comes the next film, he plays his own son.
He is playing the main character, exactly.
Now it's no longer the 70s. I believe it's like the 90s. And it's a very militaristic society, very
Fascist.
totalitarian.
Police state.
Yeah.
And allegedly in the story, like Blade Runner, pets have died. Dogs and cats have died for some reason. People start to use chimpanzees and gorillas as...
But not regular. These are a little more...
Well, we're supposed to believe they're regular, but they're in the world of the Planet of the Apes, so they're made up like the apes that we know, except they're not supposed to be speaking, they're not supposed to be of high intelligence right now. They're supposed to be service animals who are used to do tasks that nobody wants to do shopping, do yard.
Didn't they... Isn't it hinted in either this film or the previous one that it was kind of like a discovery in the jungles? They discover like a new race of apes, and they're these more upright, more human-looking apes. Isn't that how they kind of write it into it?
I don't know for sure, so I don't want to say the wrong thing. In my recollection, I just recall we're supposed to believe the majority of these apes are supposed to be apes that we know, that we see in zoos and in the jungle of our time. But for the purpose of the movie, to make them more in continuity, we're supposed to buy that these are the same ones except for Caesar.
Which is one of the biggest differences now we're dealing with between this film and the film that's about to come out. The film that's about to come out, they look like regular
Yeah,
animals.
the new movie, instead of it being a sequel to something, it's almost
remake.
like a starting, it's a remake to a degree, but it's almost a starting point. The other stuff hasn't really supposed to have happened yet. So throughout this movie, progressively, Caesar is overcome by what he sees and what is happening, and he becomes very militant and becomes more aggressive, and finally says something with his own voice that Ricardo Montalban basically has to take the heat for, to try to save him from getting caught and this whole thing turning into a disaster, which it turns into a disaster basically, especially for the humans.
Now, if the last film, or even the first film, but if the last film had very social, racial overtones, this one is completely...
And a lot of people didn't necessarily want to talk about them, but this was a way for them to talk about it and show.
And it's a very, again, the main link you can make is the Black Panther movement. It's a very militaristic, non-pacifist way of getting your point across.
And subtly, I suspect that the apes doing the tasks and being used as a service beast of burden or whatever, I imagine there's a similar, there's supposed to be a not so hidden tie into slavery.
Right. And it's an interesting concept because it's been explored in other films. You take a film like The Matrix and even Blade Runner, which has its roots on humans enslaving their service class, their server class, whether it's robots or animals, and then eventually uprising taking and extermination happening. So this film basically brings you to an end where the apes are starting to take over.
And by the end of this movie, the apes have basically overthrown their masters.
Right.
And it could be the end. This could be the end, and you could say, okay, this is where the Planet of the Apes began, and that is how it goes. And eventually Charlton Heston winds up in that world. But one more movie, and the executive said, let's go to the well one more time. And to me, this last movie is probably the weakest in many ways. They had no money for a budget. They got Roddy McDowall, but the other actors were not really A-listers. They're people we know and like, James Gregory, Paul Williams, who actually was a very popular singer and personality at the time. So it's not like these are terrible people, but it's just the production value slipped. They shot it on what looked like the back lot.
It's the Star Trek 5 of the group.
Yeah, it was basically the weak link, and let's see if we do it one more time.
So what is the plot of this fifth film?
Basically, in this movie, Caesar now has aged another 10 years, and he's a leader among his people. The other apes, the other chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans have taken their place in their society. The gorillas are now becoming more militant. The orangutans are being more political, and the chimpanzees are more of the
working class,
peaceful or scientific, class. And there's humans, and there's supposed to be humans that are still left over from the radiation. There are humans that are trying to be freed, trying to get freedom for the And basically, there's a lot of political intrigue and
Wait a second, humans left over from the radiation?
There's a couple of
Or they're trying to tie it into the second film?
they're trying to tie it in.
Oh.
There's a few different groups of people. There's the Ape Society. There's the humans, who are now being oppressed and enslaved.
They're the minority.
And there are some free humans who they tried to tie in that are part of the post-apocalyptic society of humans that are out there trying to regroup and things like that. But the apes clearly have the upper hand. And there's a lot of political intrigue, a lot of backstabbing, and by the end of the movie, there is a definite there's a definite hierarchy in ape society. But the one key thing that I remember still to this day from the first time is the chant "Ape kills ape, ape kills ape."
Oh, that's right.
And in ape society, the lawgiver has said that ape should not do harm to other apes. That's what made them different and better than human. So by the end of this movie, the apes have evolved to where the humans were.
Yeah.
And that's the full circle. And we can assume, if this continuity holds, that then eventually, years later, these characters are there, and Charlton Heston
Comes after all this.
And you have to believe, it's a little bit of a stretch, because then Charlton Heston would have had to have been there with Roddy McDowall, who plays the son and meets his father. So things fall apart a little bit, but it's still believable enough, especially since this was officially the last movie in the original franchise.
But it's also something like 1,500 or 1,700 years later, because the Charlton Heston film is 33 or 35.
So it's supposed to fit in, but it basically things change, and maybe Charlton Heston will never get there in the future because it's a paradox. There's various scientific and science fiction reasons why this can work or not work, but just suspend the disbelief and enjoy it. And basically, it was a fun series, especially as a young kid.
So what came next?
Luckily for us, I mean, as much as I wanted more movies, I'm glad they didn't. And that brings me to my next, the next part of the ape history. Instead of making a sixth movie, which I guess they could have, they said, hey, let's make a TV series. And so for the middle 70s, after these movies are done, they decide to make a TV series and almost start fresh. New actors, similar circumstances, but now instead of the New York area, which is the hidden area, it winds up they uncover that they're on Earth because they're in LA, and they realize that they're...
These take into account the previous films. These are
Not really. Not really. They don't. You could say they do if you want to believe that.
They're different name
Yeah, they're different.
astronauts.
They're different astronauts. It's almost like it's a remake for television, just using the same masks and the same premises.
Slightly lower budget.
Yeah.
It does have the feel of television.
And the problem with that is, it was basically for half a season. It's almost like a mini series. If you were to watch it now, and in fact sometimes Sci-Fi Channel or other channels will show them in a marathon. They'll cut out some episodes. The TV series didn't do very well. It was good enough for kids, but it didn't do very well. It only lasted about 13, 14, 15 episodes. In fact, there might have even been a lost episode that people think is out there, but who knows if it is or not. It might be on the box set. I have not followed up too much on that.
All right, so what happens after the TV series?
Well, after the TV series, they say we still got a little life in this, and it turns out they want to make a Saturday morning cartoon because they are still getting high demand for these.
What year is this now?
This is the 75, 76 area, middle 70s. And the cartoon is created by the people who create the Pink Panther. But if you recall a lot of early and mid 70s cartoons, a lot of corners were cut, and they would use characters. And this happened sadly in the Star Trek.
Yeah.
As good as the Star Trek cartoon was to Star Trek fans, it's very raw.
Not a lot of movement.
Not a lot of movement. The backgrounds are reused over and over again. They had that problem with the Flintstones eventually too, and the Hanna-Barbera stuff. So this also, it didn't last very many episodes. It was a little expensive, and they didn't want to really put any money into it. So it lasted the equivalent of a season in cartoon world, which is like 13 episodes.
Yep.
But they just kept replaying it for a couple years, and that happened a lot. The Star Trek animation wasn't very long. They made Emergency. They tried to just, in the 70s, tie in a lot of TV shows into cartoons. Even as far back as the 60s, they did Beatles and stuff like that. So it wasn't expected to be, again, Shakespeare. They were just trying to get kids to watch and keep the franchise alive somehow, maybe sell some comic books and some toys. And they did make toys. They made Mego toys, which were the size of the figures of the time, like the superheroes, and they made play sets and adventures. Star Trek figures were very similar to them at the time. They were still dolls back then. But it was still exciting if you were a fan of the Apes, but it really wasn't going anywhere.
That's where it kind of lost all steam.
And I kind of picked it up as a fan, ironically, because by the mid-'70s, we didn't have HBO and things like that yet. So ABC, which was Channel 7 in New York, did something called Ape Week. And it was a big deal. And every night, from Monday through Friday that particular week, they'd show one of the Planet of the Apes movies. And this was a big deal. If you wanted to watch James Bond, it was like the movie of the week. If there was a James Bond
movie of the week was a big deal.
It was a big deal because it was stuff that you might have missed or were too young. And then they would show it on a Sunday night or a weeknight during sweeps. And I remember first seeing the Planet of the Apes. The first time I saw it, I don't think I caught it all because I was a younger kid and I probably might have missed parts of it. But I remember it was very exciting. I specifically remember the third one being a little darker and saying, what's going on? Why are the people doing this to the apes now? As a kid, what you tried to learn from the first movies, that the apes are supposedly better than humans, suddenly now they're showing it. It was really exciting to watch, and that was my first foray into Ape City.
Oh yeah, same thing with me. I watched everything backwards because at its height, I wasn't even around. Now, through the 80s, there have been a couple of attempts at rehashing the whole ape storyline, whether remaking or rebooting or whatever we want to call it. The most noticeable one I remember was one that Oliver Stone wrote, which I think was a fantastic screenplay. And it got a lot of steam in terms of people were hired, pre-production had started.
And he was hot at the time.
Yes.
He was one of the big directors of that time, so this was a big coup.
I think even Schwarzenegger was attached at one point. And the best thing I remember about that particular story was that he wanted to do a story where it's the future and people are dying in terms of they can't reproduce. People are getting sterile. And the only way they can fix the sterility is to travel in time. The catch is that by traveling in time, they go to the past and realize that there's a point in human history where humans were fighting Neanderthal type of ape type of characters.
So it was really a departure from what we know.
Right.
And it might have worked, but it never happened.
But it also touched upon some religious themes. It was also kind of like a Da Vinci Code type of overtones where religious events and religious things we know now or believe now had to do with these past events.
From that, instead of what we think it does.
So it was a very ambitious, super sci-fi script. And I'm sad they never touched it because it would have been interesting.
It bounced around for a number of years with hopes, it's going to start, it's about to start, it's close to starting. And then every time Arnold would have a bigger movie, he'd move past it.
Well, they even got a director at one point, but then the script...
Chris Columbus from Harry Potter and from
a lot of people.
Gremlins was going to take over at one point as director.
And as studio heads changed at 20th Century Fox, the script started to get rewritten so that whole thing fell apart. And that was the end of that. And not until the late 90s did it start to resurface again, and this time they actually did it, which was Tim Burton.
Tim Burton, who now is the hot director of the time. Obviously, he's come off Batman, he's done a bunch of Johnny Depp movies, he's done Ed Wood, he's done stuff. He is really an artistic genius at this point, and people are saying, well, if he's interested, we're interested in working with him. And Mark Wahlberg is the hot actor of the time, having some big movies, Boogie Nights, some things that he's really getting noticed for.
And most famously, cameos from Charlton Heston, which is the gigantic big get for that movie.
And they had a phenomenal cast, except for the girl, who really wasn't a good actress, but she was very pretty.
But they apparently also had the girl that played Nova in the second film, in the first film, as doing a cameo as one of the characters in the film, which is like,
so they did it respectfully.
Yes.
It was a big budget. It was something people could look forward to. They weren't trying to just steal the franchise and exploit it. But Paul Giamatti, who had been at the start of his big career.
And Tim Roth.
And these people, they really tried to put together a story, which I think 3/4 of the way is a really good movie and well thought out movie and believable. Obviously, they do try to pander to the audience with some action that seems a little just screwy, but the big payoff to me was the finale, which I was so excited to see that because it was a takeoff on the original novel.
Yes.
And had they gone further, there were so many hopes of what could happen that with this franchise now continuing. And sadly, it made some money, it got mixed reviews,
yes.
and it just nobody really got together on it afterwards. And people just got bigger and got less interested. And again, 20th Century Fox went in different directions on things. Tim Burton went in different directions on things. And I think ultimately it just was never going to happen if Tim Burton wasn't involved because of what he had already set up. The rest of the people weren't going to flock.
Yeah, and that was like something like 12 years ago when they first started.
And so we thought throughout the 2000s that this was going to happen, but when it became obvious it was never going to happen, I think 20th Century Fox said, and especially in the past few years, said, we've got this. Let's try to just start fresh again.
Right.
And that gets us finally to Rise of the Apes.
Rise of the Planet of the Apes, which started bubbling about maybe a year and a half ago, started hearing bits and pieces that somebody wanted to do something, and then it started to trickle a little more, and a couple of months ago we got our first trailer. Now tell us what you know so far as how they're approaching this particular story.
While I'm not the biggest Planet of the Apes fan there is, I am a big enough fan that I care about it. But I have to tell you, when I first heard about it, and to me, sadly, I know a lot of people are fans of him, when I first heard James Franco was attached to it, I just figured this was going to be an average type movie because I don't expect a lot from him, even though he's a very good actor and he's actually very gutsy in the types of roles he's willing to take. I just didn't think they were going to pull it off, especially that they were going to the well once again for a remake, and I've been pleasantly surprised. I've been able to get some insight into the movie, and the way they handle this movie is very thoughtful and brilliant the way it looks. For fans of the original series, there are plenty of little hints, some that are exciting, and some that are just there. If you catch them, it'll be like, there, that's pretty cool.
What I find interesting is that it is a different approach. In other words, if you were to tell me today, hey, let's do a remake of Planet of the Apes, or something having to do with Planet of the Apes, you picture a huge cast of people in masks and costumes against a couple of humans. That's the traditional way. But here,
this is not where I think they would pick up. This is very thoughtful. It's actually very subdued, and it's contemporary in the sense that present humans are doing a lot of experimentation on animals. Whether you agree or disagree with that, that's not really part of the movie.
Yes.
There is something in the movie for both sides, but in the movie, they're doing experimentation, and this animal has been
into Alzheimer's.
This animal has been used, and other animals are being used and tested on, and it turns out the process in which they're working on has some profound effects, and this particular chimpanzee starts to exhibit some features that aren't traditional in the chimpanzee world in present day. And as the movie progresses, the process in which they move the apes, we'll call them since it's the Planet of the Apes, they utilize Andy Serkis from the Lord of the Rings, who is brilliant and probably should have won an Oscar for those performances.
Plus, he also had experience when he did King Kong.
Yeah.
He had those moves already.
Yeah. And now, if they don't make a special some kind of a
like
nomination for him for the work he's done in the process these technicians have done, this is supposedly, from what we've seen, one of the best interpretation of a monkey. There's no more man in suit here.
Yeah.
The man is the suit.
Right. And again, that's one of the biggest differences that we just talked about. We're dealing with a similar time frame of that it's being retold.
Yeah.
But instead of using a traditional man in suit, they're going all CGI on this one.
So basically, they've taken the story of Caesar, reimagined it where it comes from. In this particular story, we haven't had the Charlton Heston. This is picking up fresh. This is Ape 1. This is where it begins in this new franchise.
Unless they want to hide some weird twists.
Yeah, and there are certainly things they can do with that. God bless them if they do. I'm really excited about it. But what we see here is a retelling of the Caesar story. The apes eventually come into their own.
Here's something that I really like, and it's something that I always thought of in the past. It's one of those things like, oh, I thought of that before everybody else did, but I didn't do anything about it. It's when you do retell a story, you retell a story in a manner where the main thing about that story you're retelling, it's the minimal thing you're showing. In other words, let's say you want to do a story about like they are doing, they're redoing Alien. They're doing a sequel to Alien. It sounds to me, the way they're telling us about it, that they're kind of downplaying the mythology of the whole alien structure, and they're turning it more into a suspenseful sci-fi that turns into an alien film. This kind of, in a way, feels the same way. They're downplaying the entire history of this franchise. They want to make it more of a suspense thriller that turns into the beginning of the Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
And it's a back way of doing the reboot without being the typical bad reboot.
Yeah, it's a very smart way, like
Subtle,
you said.
like you said.
Exactly. They're not pushing it in your face like, here we are. We've got the astronauts landing. No.
It's Smurfs, everyone.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so many bad ways they could have gone. And I have to be honest with you. When I first saw the trailer, the very first trailer, I guess around Super Bowl time, it might have been before, I don't remember the time frame.
It's possible.
I was really not as impressed. I thought it was, as you said, subdued. I thought it was a little too subdued, and I felt almost like they were making a remake of the Matthew Broderick movie in the 80s that involved him saving the chimpanzees.
Yeah.
I felt it was like a more adult version of that.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Now that I know more and I've been privy to more, I'm very impressed. I think people will be pleasantly surprised, and James Franco gives a very good performance. In fact,
well, here's I'll tell you what's helping this movie. The fact that James Franco did this film after 127 Hours, which got him a lot of critical good buzz, and it propelled him to co-host the Oscars.
And it made him a little bit more mature as an actor. Until then, he'd been a very good actor, I guess. But I think he was a little, to me, I think he walked through some parts. And I'm not saying that I know, because maybe I just didn't, care for him at the time. I think he's a better actor than I gave him credit for. But I just, what I knew of him, his big roles being in Spider-Man and things like that, it never really impressed me. He was just the guy there. And what I knew of his life outside, it was just, this is just a guy who's hanging loose and getting jobs.
He like I said, 127 Hours, his performance in, I think was it Milk, the activist?
Exactly. Maybe working with Sean Penn gave him a little more maturity.
Those things he pushed him a little as far as his credentials as an actor.
And I think the way we're seeing his performance in this, it definitely helped. And I think he can become a Christian Bale type actor as he gets older, who went from a young guy who did kind of loose roles to somebody who people really respect and throws his whole heart into a part.
Now let's not forget, this film also has John Lithgow, huge actor.
Yeah, I mean, in his day, he was one of the biggest character actors.
He has done excellent work not only on film, but on television. He was probably the best bad guy in the Dexter series so far.
Yeah, it's a guy a lot of people don't know as much anymore, but he's been in everything. And once you hear his voice or once you see his face, you're like, I know that guy.
Now this trailer, when I saw it, I liked it right away. Like I said before, I like the fact that they downplayed the whole Planet of the Apes aspect. As they released further, a little bigger trailers, I kept liking it. And I'm at a point now where I'm afraid that I like this trailer and I don't want to be disappointed.
That's how I feel, because I went from not being interested. In fact, at one point, I think the movie was just going to be called Caesar, and they weren't going to highlight the whole Planet of the Apes thing. But I'm sure they did some market research and realized you got to throw the Planet of the Apes in there somewhere, because you're alienating some of your audience who might not realize, Caesar, is this a Roman movie?
Well, the director, from what I understand, already mentioned a couple of times that he sees this as the beginning of another franchise. He has other ideas as to what happens next when you end this film and what should take place after that. So he has something big in mind. Let's hope it goes that way.
As a fan of the Ape franchise, this was something that one of the first movie franchises I was involved in as a kid, watching and learning about. And, it's like I said, it's not my all-time favorite, and I'm not the biggest fan, but it has a special place, in my mind, in my heart. And I hope it continues, because I think if people overlook the original movies, as cheesy as they may think it is compared to modern films, I think they're missing something that's socially and historically important in science fiction. Because, in fact, I know for a fact, Star Wars was greenlighted in a way because of the Planet of the Apes, because in the early middle 70s the Planet of the Apes franchise was dying, and they realized that.
They needed fresh
blood. The
blood.
executive at 20th Century Fox said, okay, this guy George Lucas has a science fiction story, let's give him a try, let's give him some money to develop it and write a script, and we'll see where it goes. And as we know where that turned out. So to Star Wars fans, it's actually, maybe it was a good thing. Maybe 20th Century Fox wouldn't have gone that direction, and we might not have had Star Wars as soon as we did, or in the format we did. So I guess it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, I know. Now, this thing is being released in August, I believe. Which
It's August 5th. It may even be out already by the time you listen to this.
Yes.
And
Now,
if it is, you should probably give it a shot.
Now, let's keep in mind, August is a mixed blessing. Because on one hand, the message that it gives the viewers is that we don't have that much trust in this film, that we don't want to throw it in June, July, because that's when all the hot films are out. But in a good way, if you push it later, it doesn't have to fight with those gigantic films.
Yeah, I've learned lately the old adage that August is the graveyard of the summer blockbuster that might not make it. There was so many movies starting from early May this year, from Fast and Furious, X-Men, you had Thor, you had a number of other movies that were
Super 8,
Hangover 2.
Hangover 2.
So a movie like this, since it's not supposed to be a in-your-face blow-up movie, it's a more thoughtful movie. It gave people time to digest all that. You know, Green Lantern, Harry Potter is a juggernaut, Captain America was a juggernaut. Had this been released anywhere in that mix,
no,
I'm sure it would have been overlooked and finished like second or third in a particular week's box office, which would have given people the impression it's a failure.
It could have been out on DVD by now.
which in reality, it might not be a failure. A movie that finishes second place isn't a failure. It just happens to not outgross whatever the juggernaut is. But in this case, and there's been a few August surprises. In this case, let's hope for the best, because I hope people respond to it.
Well, let's see what happens, and I'm sure we'll have a few quick words to say after we see it. So, any final words, James?
No, I'm looking forward to it. I hope people go back who might be listening to this and not really know the Ape franchise. There's plenty of DVDs available of the TV show, the cartoon, and there's plenty of actually comic books and novels that have been put out, some of them quite good, not necessarily fitting into the world that we've talked about for this past half hour. But I think people will be pleasantly surprised, especially in the summer when you have a little extra time. Throw in at least the original movie if you haven't seen it or seen it in a while, and give it another shot. I think you'll be impressed.
Cool. Well, this wraps up our Dim Sum and a Monkey episode of Geekfest Rants.
The only thing I want to add is
the only good human is a dead human.
Oh boy, here we go.
Thanks for having me.
On behalf of James and myself, we hope to see you here next time on Geekfest Rants. Bye-bye.
This will be the end of human civilization, and the world will belong to a planet of apes!
Watch the screen explode as man faces ape in the ultimate revolution.
Where there is fire, there is smoke. And in that smoke, from this day forward, my people will plot and plan for the inevitable day of man's downfall. And that day is upon you now!
Stop.